London, midnight. A city that prides itself on calm ritual and careful words is holding its breath. Behind the gilded gates of Buckingham Palace, something ruptured, quietly, sharply, unmistakably. Multiple palace insiders confirm King Charles III and Prime Minister Keir Starmer have just clashed in a private audience described as the most confrontational in decades. No cameras, no communique, only the echo of raised voices, the chill of protocol, and the sense that a constitutional line has been crossed. Tonight, we trace what happened, what's confirmed, what's contested, and what it could mean. Not just for a monarch and a prime minister, but for a system, the unwritten constitution that depends on poise, restraint, and mutual respect. When that system wobbles, the country feels it. The weekly audience is usually predictable. A private briefing, papers reviewed, concerns exchanged, never quoted, never performed. But according to sources inside the royal household, today's meeting was different from its first minute. Hours before stepping into the palace, the Prime Minister authorized a public statement on a sensitive diplomatic initiative involving the United States announced to the world before it reached the King's desk. Palace officials learned about it as ordinary citizens did, on the news. For a sovereign who values precision, discretion, and sequence, Crown briefed. Then country, this was not a procedural snag. It was a breach. What followed, witnesses say, was terse, formal, and charged. The King, usually a master of the quiet nudge, spoke with a harder edge. He reminded the Prime Minister that the Crown is not a staging prop, that constitutional neutrality cannot be borrowed for political theater and returned when convenient. One listener called it the sharpest exchange between a monarch and a prime minister in living memory. Another described the room as Isano shouting, but no mistaking the message. There was no customary handshake still marked for the diary photographers. No symbolic image to assure the public that harmony endures. The absence itself became the message. What turns a routine audience into a rupture? In British constitutional life, it is rarely a single decision. It is sentiment accumulated and compounded. Palace advisors have watched, increasingly uneasy, as ministerial messaging has blurred the boundary between royal symbolism and political momentum. Insiders say the sovereign's patience has thinned at moments when royal presence, or even royal silence, is presumed to confer legitimacy on policy that the palace was not properly briefed on. Downing Street disputes this characterization, insisting today's conversation was constructive and respectful, yet within hours. Senior royal staff began drafting internal notes clarifying the constitutional limits of the Crown, restating the expectations of process, and, in the most delicate phrasing, signaling that neutrality is not a blank check. The palace does not govern, but it does guard, and the tremor does not stop at the Thames. Across the Commonwealth, officials asked the same question. If the head of state feels blindsided by his government, what does that do to trust? In Canada, alarm. In Australia, commentary flirting again with Republican review. The monarchy's value abroad is serenity, distance from the noise. Any suggestion of political entanglement risks that currency. Insiders describe the King's posture since the audience as quiet defiance. That phrase, in royal terms, is thunder. It means fewer joint appearances with senior ministers for now. It means polite schedule adjustments where once there were photo lines. It means, crucially, a decision to open alternate channels direct calls to Commonwealth leaders through the King's private secretary, sanctioned, legitimate, and typically routine. But tonight, interpreted as a sign of mistrust. When a monarch cross-checks government briefings, it is not insubordination. It is a constitutional precaution. Inside the palace, staff are walking on felt. Those present in the room say the King spoke one sentence that landed with historical weight. The Crown endures. Governments come and go. It is less a threat than a memory. That sovereigns are stewards, not players, that the institution outlasts any single ministry, any communications plan, any 24-hour cycle. On the government benches, the mood is divided. Loyalists urge cautiono oxygen to the story. No admission of friction. Others, privately, worry about optics. You can challenge an opposition and survive. You can challenge a newspaper and survive. But a visible rift with the Crown risks losing a constituency broader than party lines, the weary middle who still read the monarchy as a symbol of continuity when politics frays. By dawn, the tabloids wrote it loud. The broadcasters wrote it careful. The online whisper wrote it viral. And in that noise, the palace said almost nothing. A few coded lines to trusted correspondents. His Majesty values protocol. The King is committed to constitutional principles, phrases that carry a payload when translated. The Crown will not be used. Pollsters found a telling split. Support for the King edged up in samples taken within hours, especially among voters exhausted by a sense of perpetual performance politics. The Prime Minister's allies insist the numbers are ambient, not determinative. But strategy is built on tide, not tide marks. If the public reads the palace's silence as integrity, then any push against that reading risks looking like arrogance. Downing Street convened back-to-back meetings, some urging a clarifying statement, others warning that any reference to the king inflames the story. For now, the choice is to wait. But history suggests royal discontent does not dissipate on cue. It settles, it instructs, and it shapes the ground on which the next confrontation stands. This is not the first time the Sovereign's Council has scraped against a government's confidence. George III's ministers, Victoria's constitutional lessons, Elizabeth II's untelevised quiet with prime ministers of every stripe. But those collisions lived in a slower world, no live feeds of a missing handshake, no frame-by-frame analysis of an expression at the state entrance, no hashtags to harden speculation into certainty before officials can even draft a line. In the digital present, a raised eyebrow becomes a broadcast. The absence of a 5-second photograph becomes a thesis. Institutions built on understatement are being read by a culture trained to parse signals at volume. The danger is obvious. Overinterpretation can create the very crisis it claims to detect. The equal danger is denial. Pretending a rupture is routine invites the next rupture. Britain's constitution is not bound to one document. It breathes through convention, precedent, and mutual restraint. The crown reigns, but does not rule. The government governs, but does not borrow the crown. Parliament holds ministers to account. The courts police the edges. The system works when each part respects the other's silhouette. When that silhouette is smudged, when royal neutrality is presumed as a backdrop for policy performance, when briefings jump the palace, when statecraft becomes stagecraft, the unwritten rules wobble. The remedy is not spectacle, but sequence. Consult, brief, decide, announce. The crown's neutrality is strongest when it is not taken for granted. Beyond Britain, the Commonwealth watches. For some realms, the monarch remains head of state. For others, a partner in history. In all, the crown's appeal is moral distance. If a narrative hardens that the sovereign is dragged into domestic performance, Republican arguments sharpen. Tonight, quiet calls moved along private lines assurances that neutrality stands. But the very need to assure is itself a weather report. For the Prime Minister, the path narrows. Admit a rift, and you own it. Deny a rift, and photographs do the talking. Attack the palace, unthinkable. Ignore the palace, unsustainable. The remaining option is craft. Restore process, rebuild trust, and remove royal proximity from political imagery until the temperature drops. That requires accepting a constraint that modern politics dislikes. To lose a moment on camera in order to win an institution off camera. None of this decides policy. It decides posture. The difference between a government that uses the crown as a silent set piece and a government that keeps the crown out of frame. The former may win a day. The latter protects a decade. The king's advisors, veterans of multiple reigns and ministries, counsel restraint with resolve. They know the tight rope. The monarchy cannot oppose a government. It can only insist on the terms of its own neutrality. No surprise, no stage borrowing, no implication of consent where counsel was not sought. The king cannot be drawn into politics, one senior figure summarized, but nor can he allow the crown to be diminished. That is the calculus. Speak less, signal more, and use the oldest language in statecraft absence. What does the public make of a quarrel they did not vote for and cannot arbitrate? Weariness, mostly. A desire for adults in the room, a preference for institutions that still feel like anchors, not actors. When asked to choose between a government's urgency and a crown's caution, many choose neither. They choose competence. In that sense, tonight's story is not a referendum on monarchy or ministry. It is a referendum on process. The theater of British life has always been married to order. Black rods knock, the doors shut against royal presence in the Commons, then opened by consent. Rituals that teach boundaries. A prime minister who remembers that lesson will brief before he broadcasts. A sovereign who remembers it will counsel in private and correct in code. When both remember, the system hums. When one forgets, the other must remind, gently, firmly, visibly, if it must. What happens now? Expect fewer photos and more phone calls. Expect palace diaries to prioritize community and commonwealth over shared political optics. Expect Downing Street, if wise, to put a premium on process ensuring future announcements. Are orderly, properly briefed, and clearly governmental rather than quasi-royal. Expect Parliament to do what it is built to do. Ask, probe, and insist that the machinery of state runs on rules, not impressions, and expect silence. Not the silence of evasion, but the silence of recalibration. The space in which institutions retune themselves without breaking. Britain's strength is not that its constitution is written. It's that its people know how to read it when it isn't. Tonight, they are being asked to read a missing handshake. A careful phrase, a diary change, an extra phone call. The message is not melodrama. It is maintenance, a reminder that the crown endures precisely because it refuses to be used, and that governments endure longest when they remember that. Between Palace and Downing Street, a crack appeared today. It can calcify into a fracture, or it can be filled with patience, process, and the discipline that separates statecraft from show. The choice, as ever, belongs to those who hold office for a while, and to the institution that holds its tongue for a lifetime.